People are often told that slavery was something that began with the Atlantic slave trade. It is the image taught in schools, where Europeans carried Africans across the ocean in chains, forced to work on plantations in the New World. That story is true, but it is not the whole story. Behind that familiar version lies another history that is far older, far longer, and far darker. It is the history of slavery under Islamic Caliphates, a story that stretched across more than 1,000 years, and one that claimed millions of lives in silence. This was not a side note of history. It was a vast system of human suffering, one that erased entire peoples, cultures, and languages. Yet most people today have never heard it spoken in detail. Think about it. We are told every detail about the transatlantic trade, from the shackles to the auction blocks. We are taught about the ships that crossed the ocean and the plantations that swallowed human lives. But ask yourself, why do we know almost nothing about the children stolen from villages in Eastern Europe, the boys mutilated in Egypt, the women sold in markets from Baghdad to Timbuktu, or the endless caravans of bodies dying under the desert sun? How can a history that was so vast, so deadly, and so cruel be almost invisible in the way we learn about the past? That is the silence we are about to break. And once you hear it, you will never see history the same way again. The beginning of this hidden story is not in Africa, nor in the Americas, but in the rise of the caliphates that followed the spread of Islam across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Europe and Asia. With armies that swept across lands and empires, they did not only seek territory, they sought bodies. Men, women, and children were captured in wars, in raids, and in tribute, then forced into systems that treated human life as a resource to be used and discarded. Unlike the Atlantic trade, this system was not just about labor. It was about power, domination, and control. It was about breaking societies apart at their core, reshaping them into tools for empire. One of the most horrifying examples of this can be seen in the practice known as the devshirme system. Imagine a village in the Balkans centuries ago. Families are living simple lives, farming, herding, raising children. Suddenly, soldiers arrive. They come not to collect taxes or goods, but to take the boys. These children, some as young as 8 years old, are ripped from their homes and marched away. Parents scream, but resistance is useless. The boys are taken to be converted, trained, and turned into slaves of the state. They are taught new languages, stripped of their identities, and forced into service as soldiers or administrators. This was not a one-time event. It was a policy, a system, repeated generation after generation. It turned children into weapons for the empire, while leaving their families broken and their villages scarred forever. The cruelty did not stop there. Many of these boys would never see their families again. They were forced to forget their native tongues and religions, to sever every tie to their origins. Some rose to positions of power, but only within the chains of loyalty to the caliphate. Their lives were not their own. They were tools, shaped and used until they could be discarded. Imagine the trauma of a child taken from his mother's arms, raised in a world where every memory of home is forbidden. This was not just slavery of the body. It was slavery of the mind and soul. But the devshirme system was only one part of a much larger picture. Another horror was the castration industry. Boys captured in raids or purchased in markets were often castrated before being sold. The demand for eunuchs was immense, as they were used to guard harems, serve in courts, and fill roles where their inability to have families was seen as useful. The process itself was brutal. Castration in those times was not a medical procedure done with care. It was crude, done with knives, a fire, and no understanding of infection. The result was that most boys did not survive. Historians estimate that the death rate from these procedures was as high as 90%. Imagine that. For every boy who lived, 9 others bled to death, succumbed to infection, or died in agony. Entire caravans of children could be reduced to a handful of survivors by the time they reached the markets. And those who did survive, their lives were filled with humiliation and servitude. They were prized not as people, but as objects, their very mutilation making them valuable in the eyes of their masters. To think of a system that deliberately destroyed children's bodies for profit is to face a cruelty almost beyond words. This was not a rare practice. It was a thriving industry that stretched from Africa to the Middle East to Asia, fueled by demand and maintained by human suffering. The routes that carried these slaves were as deadly as the markets they ended in. Across the Sahara Desert, caravans of slaves were driven on foot, chained together, forced to march under a burning sun. The desert was merciless. Many collapsed from thirst or exhaustion, and when they did, they were left to die. No one stopped for the weak. The loss of life was staggering. Some accounts suggest that for every slave who survived the journey, many more perished along the way. The sand became a graveyard, swallowing bodies that would never be counted or remembered. These were not just journeys of commerce. They were death marches, repeated endlessly over centuries. What makes this even more tragic is that the death of so many did not slow the trade. It was simply part of the cost. For the merchants and rulers who profited, human life was cheap. A child's death was nothing compared to the wealth that could be made from those who survived. This cold calculation turned suffering into numbers, reducing people to cargo measured against profit. It is hard to imagine a cruelty more systematic, more indifferent to human pain than this. Beyond the physical destruction, there was also cultural annihilation. Entire communities were drained of their young, leaving behind villages of despair. Languages were lost as children were forced to abandon their native speech. Traditions withered as families were broken apart and never reunited. Over time, whole cultures disappeared, swallowed by the machine of slavery. What we call history today is littered with the ghosts of peoples who once existed but were erased by this relentless system. The silence of their absence is perhaps the loudest testimony to the scale of what happened. And then there was sexual slavery, carried out on an industrial scale. Women were captured in raids, wars, and markets, forced into harems that numbered in the thousands. They were stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and often their names. They existed only to serve the desires of their masters. For many, this meant a life of endless abuse. Children born of these unions were often themselves caught in the web of slavery, continuing the cycle across generations. The suffering of these women is almost impossible to put into words. It was not a single story, but millions of them, echoing across centuries in silence. The horror of this system is not just in its cruelty, but in its scale. It was not an accident or a byproduct of empire. It was deliberate, systematic, and sustained for more than 1,000 years. And yet, most people know almost nothing about it. That silence is the question we now face. How could a history so vast, so devastating, be hidden from the world for so long? The answer begins with the way history is told. Victors write the story, and the caliphates that thrived on slavery were careful in how they framed their legacy. They spoke of conquest, faith, and civilization, but rarely of the broken bodies that made it possible. Later, when European colonial powers came to dominate, they too had little interest in exposing this hidden history. After all, their own slave systems were under scrutiny. To reveal another vast system would not only complicate the narrative, it would also weaken the moral ground on which they stood. So the silence was preserved, and the world learned a distorted version of the truth. But before we confront why it was hidden, we must face more of what happened. The castration industry was not the only system of cruelty. In many regions, slaves were worked to death in ways that mirrored industrial machinery. On plantations in places like Iraq, known as the Zanj plantations, African slaves were forced to toil in salt marshes. The labor was so brutal and the conditions so toxic that life expectancy was measured in years. sometimes only months. This was not slavery designed to preserve its victims for long-term profit. It was slavery designed to consume them quickly, then replace them. When thousands died, thousands more were taken to fill the gaps. It was a conveyor belt of death, stretching on for generations. The Zanj Rebellion, one of the largest slave revolts in history, erupted from this cruelty in the 9th century. Tens of thousands of slaves rose up, demanding freedom, and for a time they shook the foundations of the Caliphate. But the rebellion was crushed, and the survivors were slaughtered. The rebellion itself is rarely mentioned today, even though it was larger than most uprisings remembered in Western history. The silence around it is part of the greater silence that covers the entire story. Another aspect that makes this system stand out is the destruction of identity. In many slave systems, slaves were at least allowed to form families and communities, even if under harsh control. Under the Caliphates, however, many slaves were deliberately prevented from forming lasting bonds. Eunuchs could not have children. Women in harems were kept under guard, their offspring often absorbed into the ruling class, but stripped of heritage. Men worked to death had no chance to pass down culture or tradition. It was a slavery not just of labor, but of existence itself. It broke the chain of generations, ensuring that whole peoples vanished from memory. Trade routes carried this cruelty across continents. The Indian Ocean slave trade funneled captives from East Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. The conditions were brutal, the journeys long, and the losses heavy. Ships were overloaded with human cargo, and disease spread like fire. Those who survived faced lives of servitude far from home, cut off from every tie that made them who they were. The Indian Ocean trade lasted longer than the Atlantic one, yet it remains almost invisible in the way history is taught. This invisibility is not an accident, it is part of the cover-up. Imagine the scale. Caravans across deserts, ships across seas, markets in every major city from Cairo to Baghdad, from Zanzibar to Istanbul. Imagine the endless stream of bodies, year after year, century after century. It is difficult to even calculate the numbers because so many died before they could be counted. Entire populations were drained, leaving gaps that can still be seen in the histories of Africa, Europe, and Asia. Linguists trace languages that vanished, archaeologists find ruins without descendants, and historians note sudden collapses of communities. Behind these disappearances lies the shadow of the slave trade. Sexual slavery deserves more attention as well, because it was not an incidental part of the system. It was central. Harems, often imagined today as exotic places of beauty, were in reality prisons for women and girls. Captured in wars, bought in markets, or taken as tribute, these women had no control over their lives. They were kept behind walls, watched constantly, and used at the whim of their masters. The idea of the harem has been romanticized, but the reality was one of abuse and captivity. Some harems contained thousands of women, each one a life stolen, a story erased. Generations of women lived and died behind those walls, never to be remembered. What made sexual slavery even more insidious was its scale and organization. There were entire networks devoted to capturing and transporting women. Raids were conducted specifically to seize them. Wars were fought with the promise of female captives as spoils. This was not just a matter of a few rulers indulging in cruelty. It was a system, deliberate and sustained, feeding the desires of those in power while destroying the lives of millions. The psychological impact of this kind of slavery is hard to measure, but it lingers in the silence of history, in the absence of voices that might have spoken if they had been free. It is tempting to think of slavery as only chains and labor, but under the Caliphates it was also a weapon of control. Enslaved people were used to project power, to humiliate enemies, and to enforce submission. Conquered peoples saw their children taken, their women enslaved, their men broken. The message was clear: resist, and you will not only be defeated, You will be erased. This use of slavery as a political and psychological weapon added another layer to its horror. It was not only about profit, but about domination at every level. The silence that surrounds this history today is almost as shocking as the history itself. How can something so vast, so deadly, remain hidden? Part of the answer lies in the way later historians chose to focus. The Atlantic trade became the central narrative, partly because it connected directly to modern history, with its ties to America and Europe. The Islamic slave trade, by contrast, stretched across regions that later fell under colonial rule, where European powers had little interest in exposing the sins of their predecessors. To admit the scale of the Caliphate's trade would be to admit that slavery was not a Western invention, but a human cruelty spread across civilizations. That truth was inconvenient, so it was pushed aside. Another part of the answer lies in the nature of the system itself. Unlike the Atlantic trade, which left descendants in the Americas whose voices demanded recognition, the Islamic trade often erased its victims completely. Castration prevented families. Death marches wiped out generations. Assimilation stripped away identities. There were fewer survivors to tell their stories, fewer descendants to demand justice. Silence was built into the system, making it easier for later generations to forget. As we look at this history, the question becomes unavoidable. How much of what we know about the past is shaped not by truth, but by what was convenient to remember? The story of slavery under the Caliphates is one of the greatest crimes in history. Yet it is barely taught, barely mentioned, and barely remembered. To uncover it is not only to honor the victims, but to challenge the way history itself is written. The cover-up of this history was not only accidental, but often deliberate. Scholars in later centuries sometimes dismissed or minimized the scale of the Islamic slave trade, focusing instead on the Atlantic system because it was closer to their own societies and politics. In many cases, documents were ignored or left untranslated. Accounts from travelers who witnessed the trade were downplayed. Even when evidence was clear, the tendency was to look away. The silence was not just a gap in knowledge. It was a choice. One reason for this choice was political convenience. During the colonial era, European powers that ruled over regions once part of the Caliphates did not want to stir up resentment by highlighting the past atrocities of Islamic empires. To point out these horrors would have risked destabilizing the very regions they wanted to control. So they emphasized narratives that served their interests, often portraying themselves as the main actors in world history. The result was a narrowed view of slavery, one that focused heavily on Europe and the Americas, while leaving out centuries of suffering elsewhere. Another reason was cultural discomfort. To admit the scale of slavery under the Caliphates would have required acknowledging that no civilization was free from cruelty. It would have meant breaking the idea that one region of the world was uniquely guilty while others were innocent. Such an admission would have complicated moral debates, especially in times when slavery was still being used to justify modern politics. Simpler stories were easier to tell, and so the complex truth was buried. Yet the evidence has always been there. Arab historians wrote about the trade. Travelers described markets where slaves were bought and sold in the thousands. Records of eunuchs, harems, and rebellions still exist. Archaeological findings show the traces of vanished peoples, cultures wiped away by systematic enslavement. The problem was not the absence of evidence, but the unwillingness to confront it. That unwillingness is what has kept this history in the shadows for so long. Consider again the impact of castration. It was not only a physical act of cruelty, it was a social tool. By cutting boys off from the possibility of family, the system ensured that they could never build a lineage, never pass on identity, never create continuity. Their lives began and ended in servitude. The mortality rate was so high that the survivors were almost anomalies, living reminders of countless others who had perished. Their very existence was a scar that showed what had been lost. The Trans-Sahara trade is another example of how this system functioned as a machine of destruction. Imagine thousands of captives forced into lines, marching across the desert under guard, the heat unbearable, the water scarce, the distance endless. Every collapse meant another life lost. The sands became a graveyard with no markers, no names, only silence. And yet the trade continued, century after century, because profit outweighed humanity. For the rulers and merchants who benefited, the suffering was just part of the cost of doing business. That cold logic is perhaps the most chilling detail of all. The Indian Ocean trade, stretching from East Africa to Arabia, Persia, and beyond, functioned much the same way. Ships overloaded with captives sailed for weeks, disease spreading through the crowded holds. Many never reached their destination. Those who did found themselves in strange lands, stripped of identity, their voices swallowed by cultures that saw them not as people, but as property. Over time, the disappearance of entire communities in East Africa and beyond can be traced to this relentless trade. The scars it left are still visible, though rarely acknowledged. Sexual slavery also left scars that reach into the present. The harems were not only prisons for women, but symbols of power for rulers. To own thousands of women was to demonstrate dominance, to display wealth and control. The suffering of the women themselves was ignored, their lives reduced to ornament and function. Generations were consumed by this system, and yet it is often remembered today through a lens of fantasy, as if the harems were places of luxury rather than horror. That distortion is part of the broader pattern of forgetting, a way of softening or erasing the cruelty that defined the system. At this point, the scale of the atrocity begins to reveal itself. It was not just about bodies. It was about the erasure of entire peoples. Languages vanished because children were taken and forced to adopt new tongues. Traditions died because families were broken and never reunited. Villages disappeared from maps because their young were drained away, leaving only the old and the weak behind. Over centuries, this destruction reshaped the human landscape of entire regions. The silence we see today is not only in history books. It is in the absence of voices that should have been there, the cultures that should have survived, but did not. Why does this matter now? Because the way we remember history shapes the way we understand the present. When a crime of this magnitude is forgotten, it leaves space for distorted narratives. It allows some to claim innocence where there was guilt, or to place blame only on others while ignoring their own past. It prevents us from seeing the full picture of human cruelty, and therefore from truly learning from it. To confront the story of slavery under the Caliphates is to confront the reality that no civilization is free from darkness. It is to acknowledge that suffering on this scale can be hidden, and that silence can be as powerful a tool of oppression as chains. The climax of this hidden story lies not just in the cruelty itself, but in the cover-up. To erase a crime is to commit it twice, once against the body and again against memory. The victims of the Caliphate's slave trade suffered their fates in life, and then their stories were erased in death. To speak of them now is not just to recount history. It is to restore a fragment of justice, to break the silence that has lasted for centuries. Every detail uncovered, every voice remembered, is a step toward making sure they are not lost completely. This is why we must tie the threads together. The Devshirme system stole children and turned them into weapons. The castration industry mutilated boys and killed most of them in the process. The Trans-Sahara and Indian Ocean routes consumed lives by the thousands, turning deserts and seas into graveyards. The harems imprisoned women on an industrial scale, their suffering hidden behind walls. The salt plantations destroyed men in cycles of death and replacement. Each system fed into the others, creating a machine that consumed human life without pause. It was not accidental, it was deliberate, organized, and sustained for more than a millennium. When we look at all of this together, we see not just a story of cruelty, but a story of erasure. A machine designed not only to enslave, but to silence, to ensure that the victims would leave little trace. And for centuries, that design succeeded. But silence can be broken. History, once uncovered, can no longer be ignored. The question now is whether we will choose to face it. The hidden fate of slaves under the Caliphates teaches us one chilling truth. The worst atrocities are not always the ones we hear about. They are often the ones buried under layers of silence. The victims of this system did not leave behind large communities of descendants to speak for them. They left behind graves in deserts, whispers in chronicles, and scars on lands that were emptied of their people. The lack of descendants demanding recognition is one reason their story faded, but it does not make their suffering less real. If anything, it makes it more urgent to uncover, because silence can kill memory just as surely as chains killed bodies. It is important to see how systematic this machine was. The Caliphates did not only take slaves from one region. They reached into Africa, Europe, Central Asia, and even parts of India. The raids were constant. Entire villages lived in fear, knowing that at any moment soldiers could arrive to seize their children or women. The wealth of empires was built on this endless supply of human beings. Taxes, armies, and courts were funded by the labor and suffering of captives. Slavery was not a side industry, it was a foundation. The economic impact was enormous. Markets thrived on the sale of slaves, and the profits fed trade networks that stretched across continents. Merchants grew rich, rulers displayed their power, and cities expanded, all on the backs of human cargo. The wealth displayed in palaces and mosques, in monuments and armies, was not only the result of conquest, it was also the product of slavery. Yet when these achievements are remembered today, the suffering that paid for them is rarely mentioned. The story told is one of golden ages and cultural brilliance, not of the broken bodies that made them possible. This selective memory is part of the larger cover-up. By focusing on art, science, and architecture, later generations painted a picture of greatness while ignoring the cruelty that fueled it. This is not to deny the achievements of those times, but to place them in context. Every empire has its shadows, and the Caliphates were no exception. Their brilliance was built on suffering. To forget that is to tell only half the story, and half the story is a lie. The scale of sexual slavery under the Caliphates also cannot be overstated. Entire populations of women were uprooted and funneled into harems or sold in markets. This did not only harm the women themselves, it destroyed the communities they were taken from. Families collapsed when mothers and daughters were stolen. Generations were lost. The trauma of those communities echoes down to this day, even if it is rarely spoken. The scars of such crimes do not vanish simply because they are ignored. They remain hidden in the silences of history, waiting to be uncovered. Another layer of this history is the role of suppression. When modern historians began to focus on slavery, much of their attention was shaped by politics. The Atlantic slave trade had survivors whose descendants demanded recognition. Civil rights movements and anti-slavery campaigns highlighted that system, and rightly so. But the Islamic slave trade had no such voices pressing for its inclusion. Many of its victims had been erased completely. Without descendants to demand remembrance, the subject was easier to avoid. Scholars could set it aside without facing pressure to address it. Over time, the silence became normal, as if the story itself did not exist. Yet some records survive, and they are damning. Chronicles describe caravans of thousands. Reports from travelers speak of markets filled with captives. Evidence of castration, harems, and plantations appear again and again. Each detail confirms the vast scale of the system, and yet, for centuries, these records were left in the margins. Only now are they beginning to be pieced together into a fuller picture. The tragedy is that so much has already been lost. We may never know the full numbers, the full names, the full stories of those who suffered, but what we do know is enough to shatter the illusion of silence. Consider the cultural destruction once more. Languages that vanish are not just words. They are ways of seeing the world, ways of living and remembering. When children were taken and forced to abandon their native speech, they were not only losing words, they were losing songs, prayers, histories, and stories. Each lost language is a library burned, a heritage destroyed. Multiply that by centuries and you see how slavery under the Caliphates reshaped the human map. The world we live in today is missing entire branches of culture that should have been there, erased by this machine of suffering. The climax of this story lies in the recognition that the cover-up itself is part of the crime. To enslave is to break bodies. To erase the history of enslavement is to break memory. Together, these two acts complete the process of dehumanization. The victims are not only denied freedom in life, but also denied remembrance in death. That is why telling their story matters so much. To break the silence is to restore dignity, even across centuries. It is to say that their suffering was real, that their lives had meaning, that they will not be forgotten. Now, as we tie these threads together, the scale becomes clearer. The Devshirme system stole children and reshaped them into weapons. The castration industry destroyed boys by the thousands, killing most in agony. The desert marches turned the Sahara into a graveyard. The Indian Ocean trade swallowed countless lives into distant lands. The harems imprisoned women in endless cycles of abuse. The plantations consumed men in labor designed to kill them. Each of these horrors was connected, forming a web of cruelty that lasted for more than 1,000 years. This was not random. It was deliberate, organized, and systematic. When people speak of slavery, they often think of chains, ships, and plantations. But the story under the Caliphates shows another side. It shows a machine designed not only to use people, but to erase them. It shows cruelty refined into policy, suffering turned into profit, and silence turned into a weapon. It shows that history itself can be shaped not by what happened, but by what is remembered. And it challenges us to ask, what other stories have been erased? What other voices have been silenced? The silence has lasted too long. To speak of this history now is to begin breaking it. To uncover the forgotten fate of slaves under the Caliphates is to honor those who cannot speak for themselves. It is to refuse the lie of silence. It is to bring light into the shadows where millions suffered and died. And it is to remind ourselves that forgetting is never innocent. Forgetting is a choice, and it can be as cruel as the act itself. The silence around this history has shaped the way we understand the world. When people imagine slavery, they almost always think of the Atlantic system, because that is the story most often told. They picture ships crossing the ocean, auctions on American soil, and plantations in the New World. That story is true, but it is not the whole truth. By focusing only on that chapter, the world has forgotten the chapters that came before and alongside it. The result is a distorted memory, one that hides the suffering of millions and leaves entire civilizations erased from common knowledge. To restore balance, we must speak of what has been left out. We must confront the reality of slavery under the Caliphates. What makes this confrontation difficult is not only the scale of the suffering, but the depth of the erasure. The victims of the Caliphate's slave system did not have descendants in large numbers to tell their stories. Castration, death marches, and assimilation wiped out their voices before they could pass them on. Unlike the survivors of the Atlantic system, who built communities and fought for recognition, the victims of this system were often left without even that chance. Their silence was built into the design, and so their memory faded faster. But silence does not erase truth. It only hides it. The truth remains, waiting to be uncovered, and when it is, it demands to be spoken. The cover-up of this history also shows how memory is shaped by power. Scholars, rulers, and later colonizers all had reasons to focus on certain stories and ignore others. The Atlantic trade fit into the politics of abolition and civil rights, while the Islamic trade did not. The result was that one system was remembered and studied, while the other was neglected. Yet the suffering of one group of people is not more important than the suffering of another. All deserve to be remembered. All deserve to have their stories told. To honor one while erasing the other is to commit injustice twice over. As we confront this hidden past, we also confront the way history is taught. For too long, the story of slavery under the Caliphates has been treated as a footnote, if mentioned at all. Textbooks often skip over it, preferring simpler narratives that focus on Europe and the Americas. Documentaries and popular culture rarely touch it, leaving the general public in ignorance. This ignorance is not harmless. It shapes the way people understand the world today. It allows myths to grow, myths of innocence and guilt, myths of unique cruelty or unique virtue. The reality is that cruelty is not unique to any one people or place. It is a human failing repeated across civilizations. To hide one chapter is to lie about the whole book. The final resolution of this story is not only about the past, it is about the present. The systems of slavery under the Caliphates may be gone, but the silence they created still lingers. Breaking that silence is an act of justice, not just for the dead, but for the living. It reminds us that human suffering cannot be erased simply because it is inconvenient. It reminds us that every story deserves to be told, even if it is ugly, even if it shatters comfortable myths. And it reminds us that the way we remember history shapes the way we act today. If we allow silence to hide cruelty, we invite cruelty to repeat itself. So we must tie the threads together one last time. The Devshirme system stole children and turned them into soldiers of empire. The castration industry mutilated boys and killed most in the process, leaving only a few to serve as reminders of the many who died. The Trans-Sahara routes turned the desert into a graveyard of unmarked bones. The Indian Ocean trade scattered lives across distant lands, cutting them off from their roots. The harems consumed generations of women in cycles of abuse, hidden behind walls that silenced their cries. The plantations destroyed men in endless labor, treating them as fuel to be burned and replaced. Each of these systems fed the others, creating a machine of human destruction that lasted more than 1,000 years. It was deliberate, it was systematic, and it was forgotten. But now, the silence can be broken. To tell this story is to honor the dead. It is to give back a fragment of voice to those who were denied it. It is to say that their lives mattered, that their suffering was real, and that they will not be erased a second time by silence. It is to challenge the way history is written, to demand that the forgotten be remembered, and to refuse the lie of omission. Every detail uncovered, every truth spoken, is a step toward justice, even across centuries. And so we come to the end, but not the end of memory. This hidden history does not belong only to the past. It belongs to us now, in the present. It belongs to every person who dares to question what they have been taught, who dares to look beyond the polished surface of history books, who dares to ask what has been left out. It belongs to anyone who refuses to accept silence as truth, and it belongs to the victims themselves, who deserve remembrance no matter how much time has passed. If you have listened to this story, you have already broken the silence. You have already taken part in restoring memory. But the work does not end here. Share what you have learned. Speak about it. Question the history you are told. Refuse to let silence erase suffering. The past cannot be changed, but the way we remember it can, and in remembering honestly, we honor the victims and learn the lessons they left behind. The unspoken fate of slaves under the Islamic Caliphates is no longer unspoken. Their story has been hidden for too long, but now it is revealed. It is a story of cruelty, of erasure, and of silence. But it is also a story of truth, uncovered at last. And in speaking it, we give the victims a voice once more. They were more than numbers, more than cargo, more than tools. They were human beings, and they deserve to be remembered as such. So do not let the silence return. Do not let the truth be buried again. Speak it, share it, and remember it. And as you do, remember that history is not just about the past. It is about the choices we make today, the stories we tell, and the voices we honor. Choose truth over silence. Choose memory over forgetting. Choose justice over comfort. That is how we honor the victims of this hidden Holocaust. That is how we ensure their suffering was not in vain. If this story has moved you, then do not let it stop here. Subscribe so you never miss the truth behind the myths. Share this with others so the silence can be broken wider. Question the history you are taught, because only by questioning can we uncover what has been hidden. And remember, the past is not as simple as the stories in textbooks. It is darker, more complex, and more urgent than we are told. But if we face it, if we tell it, if we remember it, then we can honor those who are silenced. The victims of the Caliphate's slave system deserve no less. And now, finally, their story has been spoken.